Chapter 22 The First Great Ninja War. The creation of the hidden villages had ended the Warring States period, but it had not ended warfare. Instead, it changed its scale. Where conflicts had once been fought primarily between individual clans, the new system concentrated dozens of those clans into organized military villages backed by entire nations. The Senju no longer fought only for the Senju. The Uchiha no longer fought only for the Uchiha. Shinobi now fought beneath the banners of an entire village. The same system that had brought an end to centuries of clan warfare had created military powers far larger than any individual clan could ever have become. For a time, the balance established by the first generation of Kage prevented those powers from turning against one another. It did not last. Competition between the nations continued beneath the surface. Villages needed resources, territory, political influence, and missions to sustain themselves. The great nations increasingly competed for those things, and disputes that might once have involved two clans now threatened to draw entire countries into conflict. The precise event that transformed these tensions into the First Great Ninja War has never been fully documented. Unlike later conflicts, very little surviving information identifies the war's individual campaigns or provides a complete chronology of its battles. What is known is that the fragile international order established after the Warring States period eventually collapsed. The five great nations went to war. This was something fundamentally different from the conflicts the Shinobi world had experienced before. Each hidden village could mobilize Shinobi from numerous clans, combining abilities that had once belonged to completely separate military organizations. Large-scale strategies could now be coordinated across entire countries. Intelligence networks, specialized units, supply systems, and formal chains of command became increasingly important. The battlefield itself had evolved, and so had Konoha. At some point during this period, Hashirama Senju's life came to an end. The exact circumstances of his death are never revealed. Despite his extraordinary power and the enormous importance of his character, the story never gives us a confirmed cause of death. Leadership of the Hidden Leaf passed to his younger brother. Tobirama Senju became the second Hokage. In many ways, Tobirama was exactly the kind of leader the village needed during this new period. Hashirama had been the visionary responsible for bringing former enemies together. Tobirama was the administrator who helped turn that vision into a functioning institution. He formalized systems that would become fundamental to life within Konoha. Among the institutions associated with Tobirama were the Ninja Academy, the Chunin exams, the Anbu Black Ops, and the Konoha Military Police Force. Many of these ideas would eventually be adopted in some form by other hidden villages. The purpose was larger than simple administration. The hidden village needed to replace the clan as the primary identity of the shinobi who lived within it. A child born into the Sarutobi clan could no longer be raised believing only the Sarutobi mattered. An Akamichi could not think solely as an Akamichi. A Senju could not place the Senju above everyone else. They were shinobi of Konoha. That idea would become central to the philosophy of the village. But Tobirama's policies towards one clan would have consequences that reached far beyond his own lifetime. The Uchiha. Tobirama understood the Uchiha better than most people alive. He had fought them since childhood, watched the Sharingan develop in response to powerful emotions, killed Izuna Uchiha, and witnessed Madara's eventual rejection of the village. He did not simply hate the Uchiha. as his attitude is sometimes reduced to in later retellings. He distrusted what could happen when an Uchiha experiencing profound loss allowed that grief to transform into hatred. At the same time, the Uchiha were one of Konoha's founding clans, and among its greatest military assets. Tobirama therefore placed them in charge of the newly established Konoha Military Police Force. On the surface, this gave the Uchiha considerable authority. They became responsible for maintaining law and order within the village, and were entrusted with one of Konoha's most important institutions. But the decision carried another consequence. It increasingly associated the Uchiha with the enforcement of authority, while also separating them from other parts of the village government. Years later, some would argue that Tobirama's decision had helped push the clan away from the political center of Konoha. The seeds of a future crisis had been planted. For the moment, however, there was a much more immediate threat. War was spreading across the Shinobi world. Tobirama attempted to preserve the international cooperation his brother had fought to create, including pursuing peaceful relation with the Komugakure. Those efforts would bring him face to face with two shinobi who would become infamous throughout the Hidden Cloud: Kinkaku and Ginkaku, the Gold and Silver Brothers, and their actions would eventually help bring the era of the second Hokage to a violent end. Among the most dangerous shinobi produced by Komugakure during this era were the two brothers known throughout the village as Kinkaku and Ginkaku, the Gold and Silver Brothers. Their reputation had been established long before their confrontation with Tobirama Senju. During the reign of the first Raikage, the brothers had been involved in an attempt to capture the Ninetales. The mission went catastrophically wrong when Kurama swallowed both men alive. For almost any other shinobi, that would have meant certain death. Kinkaku and Ginkaku survived. Trapped inside the Ninetales, they remained alive by eating its flesh. For 2 weeks they survived within the beast, continuing to attack it from the inside, until Kurama eventually expelled them. The experience permanently changed them. By consuming the Ninetales' flesh, the brothers acquired a portion of Kurama's chakra. They could access the power without becoming conventional Jinchuriki, eventually manifesting chakra cloaks resembling the transformations produced by the Ninetales itself. That alone made them extraordinary. But the brothers also possessed some of the most powerful weapons known to the shinobi world, the treasured tools associated with the Sage of Six Paths. Together, these abilities made Kinkaku and Ginkaku two of the most dangerous shinobi in Komugakure. They would soon become two of its most infamous criminals as well. Despite the first great ninja war spreading across the world, Tobirama continued attempting to establish peaceful relations with the other great villages. One of his most important diplomatic efforts involved Komugakure. The second Hokage and the second Raikage agreed to meet for a formal ceremony intended to establish an alliance between the Hidden Leaf and the Hidden Cloud. If successful, the agreement could have significantly altered the course of the war. Two of the most powerful hidden villages in the world would have established peaceful relations at a time when international conflict threatened to consume the entire shinobi system. The ceremony never reached its intended conclusion. Kinkaku and Ginkaku launched a coup. The exact political motivations behind their rebellion are never fully explained. What is known is that the brothers opposed the agreement and attacked during the ceremony. The second Raikage was caught in the uprising. So was Tobirama. The battle itself is never shown in full, leaving many details of the confrontation unknown. What later accounts confirm is that Kinkaku and Ginkaku used the treasured tools of the Sage of Six Paths during the attack and succeeded in driving Tobirama to the brink of death. the peace agreement collapsed. Whatever future Tobirama and the second Raikage had hoped to establish between their villages was destroyed by the coup. But Tobirama survived. This point is important because the attack during the peace ceremony is sometimes confused with the battle in which the second Hokage eventually died. They were not the same event. Tobirama recovered from the coup and continued leading Konoha during the First Great Ninja War. Kinkaku and Ginkaku, meanwhile, became remembered as some of the worst criminals in the history of the Hidden Cloud. The war continued. Eventually, Tobirama returned to the battlefield, accompanied by a group of shinobi who represented the future of Konoha. Among them were Hiruzen Sarutobi and Danzo Shimura. Also present were Hamura Mitokado, Koharu Utaten, Torifu Akamichi, and Kagami Uchiha. These were not insignificant names. Several would eventually become some of the most influential figures in the political history of the Hidden Leaf. Hiruzen would become Hokage. Danzo would eventually create root and operate for decades within the shadows of the village. Hamura and Koharu would become senior advisors. Kagami represented the Uchiha within Tobirama's own trusted circle, an important detail considering the complicated relationship that would later develop between the Uchiha and the government of Konoha. But on this particular mission, none of those future roles mattered. They were simply shinobi caught behind enemy lines. Their unit had been pursued and surrounded by a Komugakure force consisting of 20 highly skilled shinobi, the Kinkaku force. The exact membership of this unit is never revealed, nor does the manga provide a detailed account of the fighting that preceded the moment we eventually see. What matters is the situation Tobirama and his men faced. They were exhausted. The enemy had surrounded them, and escape would require someone to remain behind. Someone would have to become a decoy. The chances that person would survive were almost non-existent. Tobirama asked the group who was prepared to sacrifice themselves. For several moments, no one answered. Danzo wanted to volunteer. He understood what was required, and he wanted to prove that he possessed the courage necessary to give his life for the village. But fear stopped him. Before Danzo could force himself to speak, Hiruzen Sarutobi volunteered. The decision immediately separated the two young shinobi in Tobirama's eyes. Hiruzen had not known whether anyone else would step forward. He had not waited to see whether another person would accept the responsibility. He simply chose to sacrifice himself so that his comrades could live. Tobirama refused to allow him to do it. The second Hokage had never intended for one of his students to die in his place. The question had been a test, and Hiruzen had passed. Tobirama decided that he would remain behind. Before leaving, he gave his final instructions to the surviving members of the unit. Most importantly, he made one decision that would determine the future of Konoha. Hiruzen Sarutobi would succeed him. In the middle of the First Great Ninja War, surrounded by enemy shinobi, with almost no possibility of survival, Tobirama Senju named the third Hokage. Then the second Hokage turned back towards the enemy. His students escaped. Tobirama remained behind alone. The man who had spent his life building the institutions of Konoha would make his final contribution to the village in the same way his brother had once been willing to do, by sacrificing himself to protect the generation that would come after him. Tobirama Senju remained behind while the others escaped. What happened during the battle that followed has never been shown in full. There is no detailed account of Tobirama's final techniques, no complete record of how many members of the Kinkaku force he defeated, and no surviving description of the exact moment in which the second Hokage fell. What is known is that Tobirama deliberately placed himself between the enemy and the shinobi who would inherit the future of Konoha. he did not return. The death of Tobirama Senju brought an end to the era in which Konoha was governed directly by the brothers who had created it. Hashirama had dreamed of the village. Tobirama had helped turn that dream into a system capable of surviving without its founders. Now that system would be tested. Before making his final stand, Tobirama had selected Hiruzen Sarutobi as his successor. Hiruzen had been the first among the group to volunteer himself as the decoy, demonstrating the willingness to place the lives of his comrades ahead of his own. Tobirama recognized in him the quality he considered essential in a Hokage, the willingness to protect the village regardless of the personal cost. With Tobirama gone, Hiruzen became the third Hokage. His appointment represented an important transition in Konoha's history. For the first time, leadership of the village passed outside the Senju family. The village Hashirama had created was no longer dependent upon his bloodline. The title of Hokage could pass to someone from another clan who had inherited the principles upon which Konoha had been founded. Hiruzen had been trained directly by the first and second Hokage, and inherited much of their philosophy, but he would govern a very different world. Hashirama and Tobirama had grown up during the Warring States period, when children identified primarily with their clans, and alliances could disappear as quickly as they were created. Hiruzen belonged to the first generation that would inherit the hidden village system itself. The distinction mattered. The Senju, Uchiha, Sarutobi, Akamichi, Nara, Yamanaka, and the other families living within the Land of Fire were no longer merely allied clans. They were Konoha. That transformation was one of the most important legacies of the First Great Ninja War. But outside the village, the larger experiment in international peace had failed. The establishment of the 5 great shinobi villages had not eliminated the competition that once existed between individual clans. It had concentrated that competition into something far more dangerous. A conflict between 2 clans might involve dozens or hundreds of shinobi. A conflict between hidden villages could mobilize thousands. Each of the 5 great nations now possessed organized military forces, established chains of command, specialized shinobi, intelligence networks, and access to the enormous power represented by the tailed beasts. The scale of warfare had changed permanently. The First Great Ninja War eventually came to an end, although the exact chronology and circumstances surrounding its conclusion remain largely unexplored. There is no complete record of every battle. There is no detailed account showing precisely how the peace was negotiated. Even the exact roles played by many of the first and second Kage during the conflict remain unknown. What survives are fragments, and those fragments reveal enough. The generation that created the hidden villages had hoped those institutions would end the cycle of warfare. Instead, the first generation of villages had already fought a world war. The contradiction would define the next several decades of shinobi history. Peace still existed between wars, but increasingly it functioned as an opportunity to recover, rebuild military strength, train another generation, and prepare for whatever conflict came next. For Konoha, that responsibility now belonged to Hiruzen Sarutobi. He inherited a village that had already lost both of its founders. He also inherited the people who had survived alongside him. Hamura Mitokado and Koharu Utatane would eventually become important advisors within the government of Konoha. Danzo Shimura would follow a much darker path. The hesitation he experienced before Hiruzen volunteered to sacrifice himself remained with him. Both men wanted to protect Konoha, but over time they would develop radically different ideas about what protecting the village actually required. Hiruzen would increasingly embody the will of fire, the belief that the entire village was a family, and that the older generation existed to protect and nurture the young. Danzo would eventually come to believe that the village could survive only if someone was willing to operate in darkness, making decisions and sacrifices that Konoha's public leaders could not. That ideological divide would eventually influence some of the darkest moments in the village's history. But those events still lay decades in the future. For now, Hiruzen inherited the responsibility Tobirama had placed upon him. He would grow into one of the longest-serving Hokage in Konoha's history. He would train 3 students who would become legendary throughout the Shinobi world. He would watch another generation go to war, and another after that. Because the First Great Ninja War had demonstrated something Hashirama had desperately hoped would never be true. Creating the hidden villages had ended the age of warring clans. It had not ended the cycle of war.